Today we're going to show you how to do a faux pipe binding on a quilt. This can be used for quilts, wall hangings, placemats, table runners, a wide variety of uses. And basically a faux pipe binding is when we have a little edge of an accent piece showing between our binding and our border of our quilt. And so it's a way that you can get an extra little bit of color in there to separate the binding from the border. Also gives us a way to do the binding completely by machine. So we do a stitch in the ditch effect with that piping, and then you don't even really realize that it's all done by machine. So what we're going to start out with today, I have a quilt that measures approximately 88 inches by 106 inches. So I have done some calculations, and based on my strips of fabric, the full width of my fabric, I'm estimating that it's going to take me 9 strips of each fabric in order to do the faux pipe binding around the entire outer edge of this quilt. So I have my dark piece here, which is going to be my binding piece, and that one I am going to cut 1.5 inch strips, 1.5 inches wide, and I have 9 of those strips already cut. Normally when I cut my fabrics for any of my pieces, I actually use the lines on my cutting mat as opposed to what is on my ruler. And there's different schools of thought to this. People do it different ways. That's just what's more comfortable for me. And so I tend to cut the piece I'm going to use away from the big piece that I have by using the lines on my mat. When I'm cutting pieces for my binding like this, they're more narrow. So we have 1.5 inches, 1.75 inches, and so I kind of switch things around a little bit, and I end up using the lines on my ruler, and I put the piece that I'm going to use and cut away under my ruler piece. So I need to cut 2 more pieces of my piping lighter piece to go with my strips I have over here. So I have this lined up on 1 3/4 strip to be able to cut off of there. So I have one piece there, and I'm going to slide that away from my piece here. Sometimes we don't quite get it all cut off. There we go. So we'll slide that piece away, and then I'm going to cut one more piece that is 1 3/4 inches wide, and that should give me my 9 pieces I need for my piping part. Okay. And I have just enough fabric left. Alright, so I am using a batik and a cotton. So my cotton has my selvage edges on it here. So I'm actually going to cut my selvage edges off. And usually what I like to do is I'll line them up on the cutting mat. And then I can cut several of them at the same time. So if I just line them up where I have them filling in the line on my mat, then I know that I'm going to get all the edge cut off of there. And I can usually do, 3 or 4 at the same time. Now your edges on your batik also should be trimmed off, because we don't want those anywhere in our binding. So that was 4 pieces all at once trimmed, and we'll get these other ones trimmed. This one will line up all 5 of them. And a lot of times I will switch them over so that the shorter part, because sometimes these are not folded exactly in half, and so the shortest part side, or the side with the biggest selvage showing, then I will put it up toward me so I make sure that I get all of that edge cut off of there. Alright, so those are our piping pieces, and we will trim the edges off of these binding pieces. Okay, we'll just line them up like that. And I always line them up so I can cut on a even inch line. Then I don't have to try to figure out where those edges are. So we have 4 more pieces to go. Now I have to be a little more careful when I put my ruler down, because this is a Quilter Select ruler and it is very grippy on the back side, on the underside, and so if I try to put it down and move it, it's going to grab my fabric and shift my fabric. So I'm very careful with how I put that down so that I don't have to shift it around. So now what I need to do is I need to take all of my binding pieces and sew them in one long strip, end to end to end. And I'm going to do the same with my piping pieces. So we do join those together on a 45-degree angle, and so the easiest way to do that is to take one strip and you're going to lay it down on your cutting mat right side up. Okay, this strip is going to be coming from the left hand side. When I take my next strip, I'm going to lay that strip right side down, and I'm going to form an upside down L. Okay, so I have this strip, when I'm looking at it, it's coming from the left hand side, right side up. This strip is going to go down to form that upside down L, and it's going to be right side down. There's my intersection there. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to slide this up a little bit so you can see it. Okay, and I'm going to take a chalk liner and a small ruler. I'll just use this square, and I'm going to draw a chalk line in there. And part of the reason I'm using chalk for this one is that I can see it against the dark fabric. So I'm going to line that up corner to corner. Now if you notice this, I did offset this fabric just a little bit, because it's a lot easier on my machine to start in a little corner like this than trying to start right on the edge of the fabric when I'm joining it. And then I'm going to put a pin on this end and a pin on this end just to hold those together. Okay, so I'll be able to sew right on that chalk line from this corner to this corner. Now I'm going to continue on down till I have all 9 of them laid out together. So this piece here, the easiest way to do that is to open that up so that this one is right side up now and becomes my left hand strip. Okay, so it is right side up, and then your next piece is going to be right side down. I'm going to offset it just a little bit, and I'm going to draw that line. Now if I try to pin that and draw that line in there, my ruler tends to rock on my pins. So it's easier to draw it first and then pin it. And keep those corners of that chalk lined up on the little insets on your bottom piece of fabric. So we're going to get those all together, and we'll be back to do the piping strips. So So we have all of our piping strips pinned and ready to sew. Now we're going to repeat that same process for our piping strips. So this particular one has a definite right side and wrong side to it. So we're going to make sure that we have our right side up coming from the left. We're going to take our next strip and we're going to put it right side down, offset a little bit here, and form that upside down L. Now sometimes the batiks are really hard to tell a right and a wrong side, and so I generally figure that they're folded wrong sides together for the most part. And so when I open them up, then I usually have my fold line over here facing up to show me there. So, but this one you can definitely tell a right and a wrong side. So I'm going to have that in my upside down L, and I'm going to put my ruler in the corners here and draw my line. Now for this one, since it is a much lighter fabric, my chalk is not going to show up. So I am actually using the friction pen for this particular process. And it will show up there to give me a line to stitch on, and it will disappear with the heat of the iron. And it is on the wrong side, so I do not have to worry about that fading or showing anything on the front. So once I have that piece there, I'm now going to take this strip, and that is going to be my right side up coming from the left, and I'm going to take one more strip of this, and I'm going to make that my upside down L. So you just continue this process as you're sewing those strips together, and each time you add a new one, it's an upside down L. And I'm going to pin that. So I'm going to go ahead and get all of these together and ready to sew, and then we're going to go to the sewing machine and we're going to sew them together. Now that one moved a little bit, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to line it back up based on the line that I drew, and I'm going to pin it in place there, okay? Alright, so we are ready to sew our strips together to make the one long strip of each of our piping and our binding pieces. Now I do shorten my stitch length on my machine to 2.0. It's just a little bit of a closer stitch length to hold those pieces together. So I'm going to start with my needle up in that corner where I marked my line, my diagonal line, and I'm just going to sew that down. Now I don't stop and cut my stitches at this point in time. I'm going to go to the next intersection that I have pinned, and I'm going to do more of a chain sewing effect here. So if I can keep my pieces straightened out, I'll put my next one under here and I'll sew that next line. Okay, and we'll just keep going all the way down the line. Now as I get to each one of these, I'm going to make sure that my corners and my line that I drew is staying with the little insets that I have them lined up with. Okay, and that is the end of our 9 pieces there. So I can cut my thread, and then I can go in and snip the little thread in between each one of these. And that just saves me time, saves me a little bit of thread as well. So that is our piping pieces are done. We'll put those aside, and we're going to repeat that same process for the strips that is going to be our piping piece. Let's see. 1, 2. Last seam that I have to sew here. So I have 2 very long pieces of fabric all sewn together into one long strip. And I do have a raw edge here, an end piece here. Okay, so now I'm going to come over to the ironing board. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start by making sure that my fold lines here are pressed out nice and flat. And then each one of these intersections I'm going to press. Now I do a pressing process that might seem a little bit redundant, but it's the way that I like beginners to learn how to press these to make sure that they get everything pressed out. So first I lay it on the ironing board the way that I sewed it together. So I'm going to lay it down and I'm going to press that flat. Okay, that is setting the seam. So I'm getting it set the way I want it to actually press out to make it look nicer. So this first top layer, I'm going to bring it back and I'm going to press that open, and make sure when you do that there's no fold over edges here. It's pressed out nice and flat. Then I'm going to open it up like this and I'll press that piece down flat. Okay. And then to double check myself, I flip it over to the right side and I make sure that I have all of that pressed out nice and flat there. Now I have not trimmed any of this out yet. I prefer to do the pressing before I trim. Once you trim this, it is going to be a bias edge, which is more stretchy. And so I want to make sure I'm getting all my pressing done before I stretch out those edges there. So we're going to continue down with this. We're going to get all those folds out, and we're going to get all of the pressing done on these seams. So press it flat first, take the top layer, pull it up, press it down, And I am using a little bit of steam on my iron. Take the next one, press it down, and then flip it over and press it from the right side. When you do press this from the right side, you should notice that your strips line up after you've sewn this. So you should have one continuous strip with your edges matching. Okay, very gently going to put this over here at the cutting table so I can trim that up later. We'll repeat this same process with the piping portion. So we're going to press out that center fold, and then we're going to come to the seam, flat, top layer pulled back, flip it open from the back side, and then flip it over and press that open as well. And we'll continue down until we have all of those intersections pressed. Okay, we have both sets all pressed now, and now we can trim up that extra piece out of our seam line here. We want to get rid of that because that's too much bulk in there. So you can do this two ways. If you're comfortable with your scissor abilities, then you can trim it up here just a ways to keep it even with that other seam, that other edge of your fabric, and then you can estimate 1/4 of an inch, and you can trim that out here and then cut this top part over here even with your fabric so that that seam ends up being pressed open. If you're not comfortable with your scissors and your measurement, being able to do that 1/4 of an inch, then you can use your ruler with your rotary cutter, and you lay that down flat and you put your 1/4 inch mark on your ruler on your fabric, and you can trim that extra away here. Then you still have these little dog ear pieces, so we are just going to trim that straight up and even, and this one is also going to be trimmed even. And so we get rid of those two extra little pieces, and our seam still comes out the same way. So I'm going to make this faster by using the scissors to trim that up. The biggest challenge is finding all of your intersections here, your seams. And that one I really got off. And then we're going to repeat the process with the piping portion. Here's my first start. And just to repeat, the reason I'm doing this trimming after I've done the pressing is so that I don't have to press that when it's a cut bias edge. So now what we're going to do is we're going to sew these two pieces together. So we have our binding piece and our faux pipe piece, and we're going to sew them together on this long straight edge. When we do this, we want to make sure that our seams don't match up, because that just creates more bulk in there that we don't want them across from each other at exactly the same point. So I'm going to start by laying this out first and just seeing where those seams line up, because our fabric is different widths, and so they may not even be close to each other. And they actually, if you can see this, we have one seam here and one seam here. Okay, they're pretty close together, and I'd like them just a little bit more offset. So I'm going to take this brown piece and I'm actually going to move it up here so that I have a seam on my brown here, and I have a seam on my piping piece down here. So I do have those seams. This is the right side of my fabric right now, so I'm actually going to turn it and I'm going to put right sides together. So these will be offset approximately this much, okay? And the way I'm going to sew it on the machine, I'm actually going to line up these two edges together. So this seam is 1/4 of an inch seam allowance, and so I'm going to take a few minutes and I'm going to sew these together all the way down. Now when I do this over at the machine, I'm not pinning this and lining it up. I'm going to line it up as I go, but I'm making sure that I just very gently lay one on top of the other, and I'm not stretching one over the other. So it's just a very gentle process to putting these two together. So we'll go over to the machine and we'll get those sewn together. So I'm going to actually put one on one side of me on the floor and the other on the other side of me on the floor. And then we can bring those two together. So we're going to start right sides together. My raw edges over here are lined up with each other, and I'm going to use my 1/4 inch foot, and I'm going to stitch that seam. I don't have to worry about back stitching up there because I'm going to end up joining these two together when I get all the way around the quilt. So I can just very gently lay the smaller piece on top of the larger piece, and I can sew that seam. Realigning up here, making sure those raw edges stay even. As I get to each seam line, I'm going to make sure that that seam stays pressed open. So we are getting to the end of our strip, sewing our strip together. We just have a little bit more ways to go here. And I will tell you, looking at this, we had extra brown at the beginning and we have extra brown down here. So our brown was much wider than our off-white here. Okay, so we are at the end. I will share with you that really the trick for doing this faux pipe binding like this is how accurate you're cutting, pressing, and sewing. So I'm going to go over here before I press, and I'm going to trim the extra brown off of the end here, and I'm going to trim it off of my start point. If I can find where my start point was. There it is. Just to have it out of the way. So I'm going to press this seam. So I'm going to start by setting this seam before I press it. Now if I press it toward that brown, and I'm going to grab just a pin to hold that in place. So if I press it toward the brown piece, which is my binding piece, and then I press it over in half like this, it creates a much nicer edge when you're pressing that. If I try to press that seam toward the piped piece, and then I try to fold that over and get a nice press going up here, I'm going to be fighting that seam allowance the entire time. So I'm going to opt to not fight with it, and I'm going to press that piece toward the binding piece. So we're going to start with our binding piece being on the top when I go over to my ironing board. And so we're going to start on this end because I find it easier to press away from me. So I'm going to start with my binding piece laying on top, and I'm going to go ahead and set the seam. Okay, and then I can take my binding piece and just kind of finger press it up. Use the edge of your iron and just kind of push it out and roll up on the edge there. Okay, and that should keep that bottom seam from flipping backwards on you, and it should give you a really nice crease on that binding edge, that sewn edge. And then I can go back and press it nice and flat. So we're going to go ahead and do this all the way down. Each time I shift it and move it, I'm going to make sure that my binding piece is laying on the top. Okay, and I'm going to go ahead and set that seam for that portion. And then I'm going to press that up. I don't set my seam all the way down because part of the purpose of setting that seam is so that you don't have to worry about that seam popping back on itself underneath. And if I set the seam and then keep shifting it down and then try to go back and do this step, then there's a good chance that seam will go the opposite direction. So I want a nice flat press. So we'll do a little bit longer here, get that seam ready. So I'm just pushing that edge out away from that seam line. And this does get all twisted up, so we just have to untwist it as we go. Sometimes I get hung up right about where the seam is on the other piece, so just kind of gently persuade it to go that direction you want it to go. Alright, this is the last section of the big long strip to be able to press toward that binding piece. So once we have that all pressed, you're basically pressing it flat like this. Now we're going to go back to the beginning again, and we're going to press it in half, wrong sides together, along this entire strip to create our binding piece. Alright, back to the beginning. So when we press this in half, we're trying to be very, very, very careful that our raw edges line up, because the better that they line up, the better that we sewed it, cut it, the whole works. This little edge here, it's a tiny little edge that you're going to see, but it might vary a little bit in thickness as I go, but if I was careful about all of those previous steps and now this step here, then I should be as even as possible on this little piping piece in here. So we're going to just line those red edges up and just press it in half. as I go down this line here. So just a little bit at a time and go down the whole line. So a lot of times I'll kind of hold it there and I'll just kind of step the iron over a little bit more and adjust with my left hand those edges so that they line up as I go down the row. So if you notice how I'm just kind of picking up the iron and moving it rather quickly through there, I'm not rubbing it. And I do have steam on this. I think steam just sometimes gives it a little bit extra press in there that it needs. So once we have this step done, we will actually be able to sew it onto the quilt. So we will come back then and we will start sewing it all around the edge of the quilt. Okay, so we are getting to the end of our strip of pressing this together with our raw edges and just almost bouncing that iron down this edge to create that crease. Once we get down to the end, now we are ready to sew this onto our quilt. So we will come back and we will get our machine set up and we'll be ready to sew this onto our quilt. So we finished up all of our pressing on our binding strip and now we're ready to apply it, sew it to the quilt. So when I do this, I'm actually going to put the binding side against the wrong side, the back side of my quilt that's been quilted here. So we are going to leave a little bit of a tail. I probably leave about this much because I want to have plenty to work with when I get down to the end to sew that together. So I'm going to start sewing here with my binding side to the back side of the quilt and the piping side facing up toward me. I have put my walking foot on the machine. I prefer to sew the binding on with my walking foot so that I don't have to worry about any fold overs, any trying to feed the fabric evenly with a foot that might be pushing on it. And so the walking foot gives me the ability to sew that binding on and just walk along my fabric and not push one over the other. So I'm going to line up my raw edges. I did trim up my quilt top already, so I have all my raw edges lined up, and I am going to do a little bit of a test here to make sure I have a seam allowance I'm comfortable with. What I find is that typically I end up sewing a seam allowance that is approximately a heavy quarter, I would say, somewhere between a quarter and 3/8 of an inch. And what I'm looking for when I sew this is for the seam to be enough that when I fold my binding up and over to the front, that it fills up that binding with fabric and I don't end up with any extra kind of hanging loose on the edge. So I'm got the edge of my walking foot along the raw edges and I have adjusted my needle position over. So I'm going to test it with a 6.0. I moved that needle over to 6.0 and I'm going to go ahead and leave my stitch length at 2.5 for this one. And I am going to back stitch when I get started here. So we're going to sew down a little ways and then we're going to check it. So I just lay those raw edges together here and then I just sew that down. So that's enough of an area that I can double check this. So I'm not even going to cut my thread or take it out of the machine. I'm just going to bring this up here over to the top, and I'm going to check to see how much I can pull that up and over to cover my stitch line. And so I'll be looking at this seam right here, right, that stitch in the ditch area that is between my binding and my flange part. And so if I can pull that up and over and feel like I'm just barely over the stitch line that I did with applying my binding, then I know that I'm good here. I've got my binding nice and full, and so my seam allowance is really good. So I'm going to go ahead and continue down to the corner. Now I did start this binding on the bottom of the quilt. That's usually where I start them, is somewhere along the bottom edge. Okay. As I approach this corner here, I want to stop a seam allowance away from this edge of my quilt. Now I can do that a couple of different ways. I can either look at this and figure that I'm going to go at a diagonal line in here, or I can use a seam guide to take that exact measurement of what my seam allowance is and measure it from this raw edge here up, and that's exactly the point that I'm going to stop. Now as I approach this corner, I'm going to test it and see when I turn this quilt to come down this other side, then I want the edge of my walking foot to be right along the edge of my raw edge of my quilt backing. And I am just a little bit away, so I'm going to go back and I'm going to take just a couple more stitches. And I'll just take one and we'll check it. Okay, all I needed was one more stitch to get myself to the corner. So at this point in time, I'm going to rotate that. So I left my needle down in my fabric, and I'm going to turn my quilt so I can come down the other direction. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to back stitch all the way off of my quilt and my binding. Now when I do this, I don't have to cut that thread, and I did not have my needle raised up. My needle is still down, but my thread is enough that I can pull it toward me to be able to do this corner fold. Okay, so I'm going to start with taking my binding and I'm going to fold it back so that this raw edge lines up with this raw edge, so that it's coming straight down as if I'm going to continue sewing that. So that is step one, is I'm going to just fold that back. Now this edge right here ends up being a 45-degree angle, and this one here needs to be a 90-degree angle. So when I have that, if I can lift it up just a little bit, okay, so you can see exactly the way that that fold is, and this raw edge is coming straight up. And then I'm going to take this and I'm going to bring this back down, fold it down. Now my edge over here, I'm going to put a pin in it so I can hold it up for you to see. Okay. My edge over here covers the folded under part that I did on the previous step. So this side is covered. My fold for my binding is up along this raw edge, okay, just even there. And my raw edge here is lined up straight coming down. So now I'm going to slide it back under the machine, line up the edge of my walking foot along that raw edge, and I'm going to continue sewing. Now I did not cut those threads, and I do have a little bit longer thread because I pulled it out farther than I normally do, so I can go back and clip those off. And then I'm going to continue sewing down this side. Be sure to adjust your quilt as you go, because larger quilts get very heavy, and you need to just take time to make your adjustments before you continue sewing that binding on. So as we approach this next corner, the other way to make sure that you get that corner exactly where that seam needs to be to turn this edge here is to take your seam guide and measure your seam allowance that you have right here. So I have the edge of my seam guide here against my stitch line, and I'm going to use this slide and I'm going to push it right up against my raw edges, and that gives me an accurate measurement of what my seam allowance is. And so now I can go over to this side here on my corner, and I can put that seam gauge right, the slide right next to my raw edge, and I can put a pin right at the end of that seam gauge, and then that tells me exactly where I need to stop before I get to this edge of this corner. So I'm going to continue sewing my binding down. And I'm going to make sure that I stop with my needle right where my pin is, but do not hit your pin. So if I know I'm close enough to do one more stitch, I'm going to raise my needle, pull out my pin, and then put that needle down. And then I should be able to turn that corner, and my edge of my walking foot is right along where the edge of my quilt will be. So then I can back stitch off, lift my presser foot and pull that forward, and do my corner fold. So I'm going straight back. This one is a 90, this one is a 45. This one is going straight up, and I'm going to bring this back down and keep my raw edges all together right over here. And I have this one covered up with my 90 and my fold up along the edge here. And then I can slide that back under, and I can start stitching that seam down. Now I'm going to continue until I get close to where I started sewing my binding on. As I approach the end where I started with my binding, I am going to stop sewing right about here, and I'm going to back stitch. So I want to leave a fair amount open here so that I have room to join my binding pieces together. So I'm going to get to my stopping point there, and I'm going to go ahead and back stitch. And I can cut my thread and pull my quilt out of my machine. Now normally when I sew these together here to join this, I would do this on a 45-degree angle or a bias seam line. But because I have this piping in here, it's a lot harder to line that up on the 45. So I'm actually going to piece this together with a straight seam here. So the first thing that I do is I take my quilt here, and I'm going to just bring my ends up together and make a little fold there, and I'm going to put a pin in here. And that pin lets me work with these two pieces without having to fight with this edge here. So the first step that I need to do when I get ready to join is to know how much of my binding I need to leave to match up this area that I have open here. So I'm going to smooth my binding down and I'm going to pin it in place. Now I do not need all of this extra here because I need room to be able to join this to this piece here. So I'm going to trim that just straight across and just trim a little bit of that off of there. And then that will be my intersection of the two pieces of my binding. So now I will come from this direction and I will pin that down in place as well. And I'm going to put a pin right here where those two binding pieces match. So I have the top one that's overlapping, so I'm going to put a seam allowance on it. And then I have this one underneath where the raw edge is right here, and that's where I put the pin to know that that's where those two pieces are going to meet. Now as far as my seam allowance on this, I know that running along the edge of my walking foot is going to be the seam allowance that I have on my seam gauge. And so if I measure one seam allowance for the top piece and one seam allowance for the bottom piece, then I can trim that and I will be able to sew a seam in along the edge of my walking foot. So my first measurement will be here, and I will just put a little pin right through the layers straight in, and then I will do that again, and I will snip that right where that slide bar is. And I can take out my pins now. So basically what I did on this top part is I just combined the two seam allowances that would be taken up by the top piece and the bottom piece. And I just combined them and then trim that away. So now this one I can trim straight across. Okay. So now I can take my quilt sandwich, and I need to be able to work with these two pieces without this fighting with me. So I'm going to bunch this up like this, and I'm going to put a pin in there just to hold it out of my way. So now I can work with these two straight and not getting a twist in it. So I make sure that my two pieces are going to come together just like they need to be. So I can join up my binding piece here and put a pin at the edge. Now this is going to have a stacked seam, and so a stacked seam is when two seams come together and they're pressed in the same direction. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this top seam and I'm going to flip it forward. That's not the way it's pressed, so I'm going to flip it forward and I'm going to bring that seam out so that those two will be opposite directions and they will nestle together. Now I'm not going to sew it in that way, I'm just doing that to hold it together so I can stitch a seam and have a higher likelihood that these are going to line up. So if I put the pin on this side, then I can flip that seam back down and I can sew this seam. And I did leave my walking foot on here, I have not changed it. So once I sew that seam, then I can finger press this opening here, and I think I have it lined up pretty good. I'll finger press it and then I will fold that back over like this, and I do have a really nice match right there. So I can fold it over and I can pin that edge together. So once I do all of that, I can take this pin out holding my quilt together, and I can lay this out, and now I'm going to go ahead and sew this last bit of the binding to my quilt. Now I do need to keep track of how much I need to ease everything together, so I do pin at this point my binding to the back of my quilt. Okay, now I can sew the last part of this binding piece down. Now it's not necessary to back stitch unless you want to, but you can overlap those stitches, and sometimes that creates that hold that you need to have for that stitch, that seam line. And my seam here is finger pressed open and folded down. And that is it. I now have my binding all applied to the back part of my quilt. Now my next step is that I'm going to bring this up and over to the front, and now I'm going to stitch in the ditch and top stitch it down. The nice thing about cotton batting, if you have cotton batting in your quilt, is you could actually take this over to the ironing board and you could press this binding out to the edge, and that just makes it a lot easier to bring up and over and fold it down and stitch it. So I'm not going to do that on this step. So I'm going to just take my fingers and kind of pull this binding straight out, and I'm going to bring it up and over, and I'm going to feel with my finger, sometimes you can feel it with your fingernail, just run that along the edge where your seam line was when you first applied that binding. So you want to make sure that the piping part of your binding is going to be just over the stitch line that you applied your binding with. And I am going to move my needle position. This is a step that is really easy to do with a stitch in the ditch foot or a stitch in the ditch attachment for some of the dual feed feet that we have with the machines. The walking foot that I'm using does not have that attachment on it. So I am going to just move my needle to where I can see it, and I'm going to use my walking foot to stitch this down. So I'm going to start here so that I can show you how to fold this corner as you get to it. So we're just going to get started. And if you use matching thread with your piping fabric, then you should not see that stitching stand out at all. So as I approach this corner, I'm going to put my thumb under the back side here, and I'm going to make sure that I pull that out and have it nice and straight. Now, one of the things that we have discovered is it's a lot easier to fold this side over first on your piping, on your binding, and then make this side come down over the top of it. So I'm going to bring this edge up and over, and I'm going to put a pin in it to hold it in place. Okay, so that's just holding it out of the way. Sometimes we need to pin things in order to keep them from pulling against us and make things easier to work with. So this corner here now, I'm going to have it coming straight over here and laying down, and then I can kind of pull that out and make sure that my corner is going to stay a mitered corner. So sometimes we have to push a little bit more extra up into this corner piece here. Put a little bit more fabric in there and then bring that up and over. And I'm going to pin this in place so that I can show that to you. Okay. So what we're trying to do here, you can see that, is we want the two parts of the piping part of our binding to match when it comes to this corner. So I'm going to stitch that, and I want to be able to show that to you once I get it stitched down. I don't want to sew over my pins, so sometimes I have to get that pin in there just right in order to hold that corner in there and not shift when I put my presser foot down. So I'm going to show you this corner now, okay? And so our goal is that we're making those 2 points here match each other when I fold that and come around the corner to stitch. And so you just continue stitching this in the ditch as you go all the way around the quilt. Now from the back side, you are going to have a little bit of that stitch line showing right inside the edge of your binding here. It should be running really close along that edge, and that is going to determine, basically it's going to be determined by how well you put this ditch part right over the stitch line on the front side. So you can see that it just is coming right along here, so just leaving a tiny bit between the stitch line and the binding. So then you can continue stitching all the way around the quilt, and then you will be all done with your faux piped binding. Thank you for joining us for another Tips and Techniques video.